Adelaide Monroe stood at her engagement gala, cameras blazing, while her parents smiled beside Zane Whitman. She lifted the diamond ring, paused, then set it on the podium. "I won't marry a contract," she said. And the ballroom froze. Outside, security shoved a broke single dad, Henry Brooks, away from the doors as his 7-year-old daughter Gwen clung to his neck. Henry didn't beg, he simply turned into the rain. Something in that quiet dignity cracked Adelaide. She sprinted after him, heels slipping, and whispered the sentence that detonated her empire, "Henry, marry me. Right now. Before I lose you." The rain fell harder, soaking through Adelaide's $10,000 gown, as if the sky itself wanted to strip away every layer of pretense she had worn for 32 years. Behind her, the Grand Monarch Hotel blazed with golden light. 500 guests frozen mid-champagne toast, their whispers already spreading like wildfire through the city's elite circles. But Adelaide Monroe, CEO of Monroe Industries, the woman Forbes had called the Ice Queen of Wall Street, stood barefoot on wet pavement, her heels abandoned somewhere between the ballroom and this moment of insanity. Henry Brooks stared at her as if she had grown a second head. His daughter Gwen peeked from behind his shoulder, her small arms wrapped tight around his neck. Henry's jacket was thin, already soaked through, and Adelaide could see the patches on his elbows, the worn collar, the kind of poverty that didn't scream but whispered its presence in every carefully mended seam. But his eyes held no pity for himself, no envy for her, nothing but a quiet assessment that made Adelaide feel more exposed than she had ever felt in her life. "Are you proposing?" Henry said slowly, his voice carrying no awe, no flattery, no fear. "Or are you signing another contract?" The question hit Adelaide like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, because the truth was, she didn't know anymore. She didn't know where the chess moves ended, and her actual feelings began. For 32 years, she had been trained to see every interaction as a transaction, every relationship as a balance sheet. Love was a liability. Trust was a weakness. Vulnerability was a door left unlocked for enemies to enter. 3 hours earlier, Adelaide had discovered a clause buried in page 47 of her prenuptial agreement with Zane Whitman. A clause that would give his family controlling interest in Monroe Industries within 90 days of the marriage. A clause her own father had approved. A clause that meant she wasn't gaining a husband tonight. She was losing her empire. Zane Whitman was perfect on paper. Old money stretching back 5 generations. Harvard educated with honors. Impeccable manners that made investors feel safe. But Adelaide had learned to read men like quarterly reports. And something in Zane's eyes always calculated, always measured, always counted the value of every word she spoke. He didn't love her. He loved what she controlled. Her mother, Constance Monroe, had spent 2 decades treating marriage like a merger strategy. Her father, William Monroe, had built his fortune on handshakes that hid knives. And tonight, they had both smiled as they handed their daughter to a man who would dismantle everything she had built. So Adelaide had done the unthinkable. She had walked to that podium, looked at 500 faces expecting a fairy tale, and set the ring down like a grenade. The gasp that rippled through the room had felt like oxygen after years of holding her breath. But walking away from Zane was only half the equation. The board of directors was already fractured, half of them loyal to her vision, the other half waiting for any excuse to install someone more controllable. By tomorrow morning, the headlines would paint her as unstable, emotional, unfit to lead. That was when she saw Henry. He had been crouched near the service entrance, tools spread around him, working on something electrical that the hotel staff had dismissed as unfixable. Adelaide had watched through the window as he diagnosed the problem in seconds. Then the event manager had appeared, refusing to pay the full amount because Henry wasn't wearing the right clothes, because he didn't have a business card, because he was nobody. Henry hadn't argued, he hadn't begged, he hadn't raised his voice or demanded respect. He had simply gathered his tools, lifted his daughter onto his hip, and walked into the rain with his head high. His dignity wasn't performed. It was bone deep. Earned through years of being underestimated and still refusing to compromise who he was. And something in Adelaide's chest had cracked bit wide open. Because she recognized that dignity. She recognized the feeling of being dismissed, undervalued, treated like a prop in someone else's story. The only difference was that Henry wore poverty while she wore Valentino, but they were both being pushed around by people who saw them as means to an end, never as human beings worthy of respect. So, she had run. Not toward something, but away from everything she had been programmed to accept. And now she stood in the rain, asking a stranger to save her, and she couldn't even explain why. "I'm not asking you to love me," Adelaide said, her voice shaking. "I'm asking you for one day to prove I'm not using you as a chess piece." Henry's jaw tightened. His daughter whispered something in his ear, too soft for Adelaide to hear. He looked at Gwen for a long moment, studying her face as if searching for permission or guidance, then back at Adelaide. "One day," he said, "but you don't come near my daughter with your problems. She's not a prop, she's not a photo opportunity. She's the only good thing I've ever done, and I won't let anyone use her." Behind them, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Bonnie, Adelaide's assistant, leaned out the window, her face pale with panic, her phone clutched in white-knuckled fingers. "Adelaide, the video is already online. The hashtags are trending. Your father called 7 times. He said if you don't come back right now, you'll lose your seat by morning. The board is already planning an emergency session." Adelaide didn't move. The rain ran down her face like tears she had forgotten how to cry. "Let them watch," she said. That night, Henry returned to his apartment to find an eviction notice taped to his door. Final warning: 3 days to pay or vacate. $750 past due. He stared at the paper for a long moment, feeling the weight of it in his hands, then crumpled it in his fist and carried Gwen inside. The apartment was small, barely 600 square feet, but Henry had made it a home. Gwen's drawings covered the refrigerator, a gallery of crayon princesses and rocket ships and flowers with faces. A second-hand bookshelf held her favorite stories, their spines cracked from rereading. The kitchen table wobbled slightly, one leg shorter than the others, but Henry had fixed it himself with a folded piece of cardboard, just like he fixed everything in their lives that threatened to break. He put Gwen to bed, reading her favorite story about a princess who saved herself, then sat alone in the dark, staring at the eviction notice. The numbers blurred before his eyes. $750 might as well have been $750,000. He had exactly $83 in his checking account and 2 weeks until his next scheduled job. He had been a skilled technician once, good enough to work for one of the biggest corporations in the city, good enough to trust his supervisors when they said the safety protocols were fine. Just fine. Don't worry about those warning signs. Good enough to become the scapegoat when everything went wrong. The company that destroyed him was Monroe Industries. He didn't know Adelaide was the CEO. He didn't know the woman who had just proposed to him in the rain was the daughter of the man who had signed off on burying his career. All he knew was that she had looked at him like he was a human being, and that was more than anyone had done in years. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. A message that made his blood run cold. "Tomorrow, Mr. Brooks. We need to discuss your daughter's living conditions. Please be available for inspection." Adelaide arrived at Henry's apartment the next morning with nothing but her assistant and her pride. She had left the town car 3 blocks away. She had dressed in clothes that cost less than her usual shoes. She was trying, clumsily, desperately, to become someone worthy of the man who hadn't kneeled. The apartment building was old, the hallway dim, the smell of cooking oil and laundry detergent thick in the air. Adelaide climbed 5 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken for years. She had never been anywhere like this. She had never seen how most people actually lived. Henry opened the door with Gwen hiding behind his legs. His face was guarded, suspicious, waiting for the catch. He wore the same clothes from the night before, slightly less wet, and Adelaide realized with a start that he probably didn't own many alternatives. "I brought coffee," Adelaide said, holding up a paper bag. "And I didn't know what Gwen liked, so I got hot chocolate, and a croissant, and a muffin, and some kind of breakfast sandwich. I don't actually know how to shop for normal food. I usually just tell someone what I want, and it appears." Gwen giggled. Henry's expression cracked. Just slightly. Inside, Adelaide saw everything. The careful budgeting evident in every choice. The single piece of meat Henry had cut into Gwen's portion while he ate plain noodles. The way Gwen's shoes were scuffed but polished, worn but loved. The refrigerator that hummed too loudly because the compressor was failing. The window that had been patched with tape because the landlord wouldn't fix it. "Can you wash dishes?" Gwen asked suddenly, her voice carrying the innocent cruelty of children who haven't learned to soften their observations. Adelaide blinked. I've never actually tried." "I can teach you," Gwen said seriously, nodding like a professor accepting a particularly slow student. "It's not hard. You just have to be careful with the hot water." So Adelaide Monroe, CEO of a billion-dollar corporation, stood at a tiny sink and learned to wash dishes from a 7-year-old girl. She burned her hands on water that was too hot. She dropped a bowl and watched it shatter on the floor. She used too much soap and created a mountain of bubbles. She felt more useless than she had ever felt in her life. And somehow, that uselessness felt like freedom. Henry watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But when Adelaide knelt to clean up the broken bowl without complaint, without calling someone else to handle it, without making any comment about replacing it with something better, something shifted in his eyes. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Out of everyone in that ballroom, out of every man who would have done anything for a chance with you, why did you chase the man they threw away?" Adelaide looked up at him, her hands still wet, her designer clothes stained with dishwater, her careful composure abandoned somewhere on the kitchen floor. "Because you were the only person all night who didn't want anything from me." Later, after Gwen had fallen asleep on the couch wrapped in a blanket Henry had bought at a thrift store, Adelaide told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. The prenuptial clause that would have stripped her of power. The board's slow betrayal over years of planted doubts. Her parents' manipulation of every relationship she had ever attempted. The fact that she was about to lose everything she had spent her life building. "So you need a distraction," Henry said flatly. "Someone to make you look stable. A human shield. A prop." "No," Adelaide's voice was firm. I need someone who will tell me when I'm wrong. Everyone in my life says yes. Everyone agrees. Everyone bows. Everyone tells me what I want to hear because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. I'm drowning in approval, and I can't trust any of it." Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them both. "I worked for your company once, years ago, before Gwen, before everything fell apart." Adelaide felt the floor shift beneath her. "There was an accident," Henry continued, his voice steady, but his hands tight on the kitchen counter. "A safety violation that management ignored because fixing it would have delayed the project. When it went wrong, when someone got hurt, they needed someone to blame, someone disposable, someone without lawyers or connections or power." He looked at her with eyes that held years of quiet rage, carefully contained, never fully extinguished. "I was that someone. I lost my job. I lost my reputation. I lost my wife, who didn't sign up to be married to a man everyone called a criminal. I lost everything except Gwen." Adelaide couldn't breathe. The woman Zane had warned her about, the unstable CEO who made impulsive decisions, suddenly felt very real, because she had proposed to a man her own company had destroyed, and she hadn't even known. "Henry, don't." His voice was sharp. "Don't apologize for something you didn't do, but don't pretend you're saving me either. I don't need saving. I need my daughter to be safe. That's all I've ever needed." A knock at the door made them both freeze. Outside stood a man in a crisp suit, holding official papers with government seals. Child Protective Services. An anonymous complaint had been filed about Henry's living conditions. Concerns about safety. Concerns about stability. Concerns about a child being raised in poverty by a man with a criminal record. And Adelaide knew, with sickening certainty, exactly who had made that call. The next days blurred together in a haze of legal threats and media attacks. Zane Whitman had wasted no time. He had spent years preparing for the possibility that Adelaide might resist. And he had contingencies for his contingencies. The tabloids painted Adelaide as a woman in crisis, chasing inappropriate men, abandoning her responsibilities to the company and to her family. The board demanded an emergency meeting. Her father threatened to strip her voting rights. Her mother called once, not to offer support but to express disappointment, then hung up without saying goodbye. But the cruelest blow was aimed at Henry. Every client who had hired him for maintenance and repair work suddenly canceled. Every contact who had recommended his work went silent. The coffee shop owner who had given him odd jobs pretended not to know him. The building manager who had let him fix things in exchange for rent reduction received a call warning about liability. Someone had systematically destroyed his income. And when Adelaide traced the payments back far enough, through shell companies and anonymous accounts, the name Whitman appeared like a signature on a death warrant. Henry refused her money. When Adelaide tried to pay his rent, he handed the check back without looking at the amount. "I won't take charity," he said. "Not from you, not from anyone. My daughter will not grow up thinking her father was bought." "Then let me give you a job," Adelaide said. "A real one, not charity, not a gift. Work that you're qualified for, work that I've been trying to fill for 2 years." She proposed something unusual. Monroe Industries needed someone to oversee community technical programs, to bridge the gap between corporate resources and people who had been left behind by the economy. Someone who understood both worlds. Someone who could speak to executives about cost-benefit analysis and speak to workers about actual needs. Someone like Henry. "It's not a gift," Adelaide said. "It's a position I've been trying to fill for months. You're qualified, more than qualified." And if you don't take it, I'll have to give it to someone who will do half the job for twice the ego." Henry looked at her for a long moment. "And if I take it, what happens to us this arrangement? This marriage, whatever we're calling it?" "I don't know," Adelaide admitted. "But I'd rather figure it out together than keep drowning alone." They signed the marriage contract that evening. Not in a church, not with photographers, not with 500 witnesses judging every detail. Just a city hall ceremony with Bonnie as witness, Silas handling the paperwork, and Gwen drawing pictures in the corner, occasionally glancing up to make sure her father was still there. The terms were clear. 6 months. A partnership based on mutual benefit and mutual respect, no romantic obligations, no physical expectations, full protection for Gwen, including a trust fund for her education that would remain regardless of what happened between Adelaide and Henry. Henry added his own clause, written in his own handwriting on the final page. No media access to Gwen, no public appearances for his daughter, no photographs, no interviews, no stories using her as a prop. She was not part of the deal. She was never part of the deal. Adelaide signed without hesitation. That night, as they left the lawyer's office, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Henry Brooks used to work for Monroe. Ask yourself why he was really outside that hotel. Ask yourself if you're the one being played. Adelaide deleted the message. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The first weeks of their arrangement were a strange dance of boundaries and discoveries. Adelaide moved into Henry's apartment rather than relocating them to her penthouse. She wanted to learn how to live in his world before asking him to navigate hers. She wanted to understand what she had been blind to for her entire privileged life. She was terrible at it. She burned toast on her first morning, setting off the smoke detector and waking the entire floor. She forgot that laundry required sorting by color and ruined 3 of Henry's white shirts with a red sock. She called a plumber for a clogged drain that Henry fixed in 30 seconds with a wire hanger, shaking his head at the $200 emergency service fee she had almost paid. But she didn't quit. Every failure, she treated like a business problem to solve. Every mistake, she documented and corrected. She bought a notebook and filled it with observations how much things actually cost, how long repairs actually took, how much energy it required to maintain a household without staff. Gwen became her unlikely teacher, explaining the mysteries of grocery store coupons and public transportation and which brands were the same product in different packaging. "You really don't know anything," Gwen observed one afternoon, watching Adelaide struggle with a can opener. "I know a lot of things," Adelaide said, fighting the urge to throw the can across the room. "Just not useful things." "What do you know? I know how to read a quarterly earnings report. I know how to negotiate with hostile board members. I know which fork to use at formal dinners and how to make small talk with diplomats." Gwen considered this. "Those don't seem very important." "No," Adelaide agreed, finally conquering the can opener. "They really don't." Henry watched from the kitchen doorway, his expression softening despite himself. Adelaide was trying, genuinely, clumsily, desperately trying. And that effort, that willingness to be terrible at something in order to learn, meant more than all the money she could have thrown at their problems. At a business dinner 2 weeks later, everything changed. A colleague of Adelaide's father made a joke about Henry's background. Something about charity cases and gold diggers and women who couldn't find a real man, so they had to buy one. The table laughed politely, the way wealthy people laugh at jokes that aren't funny, but come from someone powerful enough to expect applause. Adelaide did not laugh. Henry fixed an electrical system your maintenance team couldn't figure out in 3 months, she said, her voice cutting through the fading chuckles like ice. He rebuilt his life from nothing, while your trust fund rebuilt itself in your sleep. He's worth more than everyone at this table combined, and you'll speak to him with respect, or you'll speak to my lawyers about the harassment policy you just violated. The table went silent. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips, silverware stilled on plates. Henry stared at Adelaide as if seeing her for the first time. Later, in the car, he said quietly, "You didn't have to do that. I've heard worse. I've survived worse. Yes, I did have to do that." Adelaide looked out the window at the city lights passing by, buildings full of people living lives she was only beginning to understand. "I've spent my whole life watching people be cruel to anyone they considered beneath them. I never said anything because I was afraid of losing my place at the table, but that table is full of cowards, Henry, and I'm tired of being one of them." When they returned to the apartment, Henry found that every handyman job he had scheduled for the next 2 months had been cancelled. Phone calls not returned. Doors that had been opened suddenly closed. Someone had called each client, warned them about hiring him, threatened consequences for anyone who gave him work. The name behind the calls, hidden behind layers of intermediaries but eventually traceable, was Whitman. Zane was no longer playing politics. He was playing war. The attack on Gwen came without warning, on a Tuesday morning that had seemed like any other. Children at her school had heard rumors: gold digger, charity case, a little girl whose father had sold her to a rich woman, a family that wasn't real, just pretend, just for money. The words were cruel in the specific way that children learn from their parents, repeating insults they don't fully understand but know are meant to wound. Gwen came home crying, asking Henry if he had sold her, if she was worth money now, if Adelaide was going to send her away when she got bored, if any of this was real or just another job. Henry held his daughter and felt something break inside him. All the careful walls he had built, all the quiet dignity he had maintained through years of poverty and dismissal and injustice, crumbled in the face of his daughter's tears. Adelaide found them in the kitchen, Gwen sobbing into Henry's chest, and for the first time, the Ice Queen of Wall Street didn't know what to say. All her skills with words and strategy and negotiation meant nothing against a child's pain. She knelt beside them both. "Gwen," she said softly, "your father didn't sell you. He loves you more than anything in the world. He married me because he wanted to protect you, to give you a safe place to live, to make sure no one could take you away from him. And I'm not going anywhere. Not because of a contract, but because you taught me how to wash dishes. And I still owe you for that." Gwen hiccuped. "You still drop things." "I know. I'm working on it." "And you burn toast." "Also true. And you don't know how to braid hair." "I've been watching videos. I'm going to figure it out." Gwen was quiet for a moment, her tears slowing. Then she said, in a small voice, "Promise you won't leave." Adelaide felt her heart crack. "I promise." That night, after Gwen finally fell asleep, Henry and Adelaide sat in the kitchen and planned their war. They had evidence. Bonnie had been collecting documentation of Zane's interference. Adelaide's lawyer, Silas, had traced financial connections between Whitman and the media outlets attacking them. An old colleague named Otis had come forward with proof that the accident years ago had been covered up, that Henry had been deliberately sacrificed. But using that evidence meant Adelaide would have to expose her own family's complicity. Her father had approved the cover-up. Her mother had helped arrange the marriage to Zane. Going public meant burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. You'll lose them, Henry said. I lost them a long time ago. Adelaide replied, I just didn't know it. Or maybe I knew and didn't want to admit it. They never loved me. Henry, they loved what I could do for them. The moment I stopped being useful, they would have discarded me just like they discarded you. The board meeting arrived like a reckoning. On a gray morning that seemed to hold its breath, Zane Whitman sat in the front row, flanked by lawyers in identical dark suits, his smile confident, his posture relaxed. He had spent weeks positioning himself as the reasonable choice. The steady hand that Monroe Industries needed after its CEO's very public breakdown. Constance and William Monroe sat beside him, their faces carefully neutral, revealing nothing. They had chosen their side, and it wasn't their daughter's. Adelaide walked to the podium alone. The vote was called. Motions were made to remove her from leadership, citing instability, poor judgment, conduct unbecoming of a CEO. Zane's lawyers presented their case with smooth efficiency. Half the board nodded along, already convinced. And then Adelaide began to speak. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize for her decisions or promise to be more controllable in the future. Instead, she laid out evidence like a prosecutor, connecting dots that no one had thought to examine. The prenuptial clause that would have transferred control, the financial flows to media outlets that had attacked her, the systematic destruction of Henry's livelihood, the anonymous complaints to child services, timed perfectly to coincide with Adelaide's attempts to stabilize her position. And finally, the cover-up from years ago, the accident that should have ended careers, but instead ended only one man's future, the safety violations that management ignored, the report that was altered before investigators saw it, the witness testimony that was suppressed. This company was built on a lie, Adelaide said, her voice steady. I didn't know it until recently, but now I do. And I'm standing here today because a man they tried to destroy taught me that integrity matters more than power. Henry walked to the podium. He wore no suit, no tie, no armor of wealth or status, just clean clothes and steady hands, and years of truth finally being told. He didn't give a speech. He simply told his story. The work he had done, the pride he had taken in it, the trust he had placed in his supervisors. The morning he arrived to find security waiting to escort him out, his name already attached to blame he didn't deserve. The years of struggling, of being turned away from jobs because of a record that should never have existed, of watching his daughter wonder why they couldn't afford things other families had. Gwen was not there. She was safe, protected, with Bonnie in a secure location away from the cameras. But Adelaide read a letter aloud that the little girl had written, in careful handwriting that wobbled slightly at the edges. My daddy is not a bad person. He fixes things when they break. He makes breakfast even when he's tired. He tells me stories every night even when he's sad. Please don't take him away from me. I already lost my mommy. I can't lose my daddy too. The room fell silent. Zane stood, his composure cracking for the first time, his smooth voice rising to something closer to a shout. He accused Adelaide of manipulation, of staging evidence, of using a child as a weapon, of being exactly the unstable mess he had warned everyone about. I never used her, Adelaide said quietly. That's the difference between us. Zane, you see people as tools. I'm learning to see them as people. The vote shifted. Board members who had been ready to remove Adelaide looked at the evidence, looked at each other, looked at Zane's increasingly desperate denials. The connections were too clear, the money trails too obvious, the pattern of harassment too systematic to be coincidence. By the end of the meeting, Zane Whitman was not accepting a CEO position. He was explaining his actions to investigators who had been waiting outside. His lawyers suddenly very quiet. His confident smile replaced by something closer to fear. Adelaide kept her company, but she lost her parents. Constance and William walked out without a word, their silence louder than any condemnation. They had bet on Zane. They had bet on control. And their daughter had chosen a broke single dad over everything they had built, over everything they had tried to make her become. In the weeks that followed, things changed slowly. Then all at once, Henry's name was cleared, the old case was reopened, the original evidence reviewed, the altered reports exposed. He received an official apology letter from Monroe Industries, signed by Adelaide personally, acknowledging what had been done and offering compensation he had never asked for. He didn't take the money. Instead, he asked that it be donated to a fund for workers who had been wrongfully terminated, for people who had been crushed by corporations and had no one to fight for them. The CPS investigation closed with no action taken. The anonymous complaints were traced back to Whitman's network, and the investigator who had first come to their door apologized personally, embarrassed to have been used as a weapon against a loving father. Gwen returned to school with her head high, her classmates' cruelty fading as their parents heard the truth and adjusted their own behavior accordingly. Children forgot quickly when there was nothing left to mock. Adelaide and Henry's 6-month contract approached its end. They sat in the kitchen one evening, Gwen asleep in the next room, the apartment quiet around them. The same apartment where Adelaide had learned to wash dishes, burn toast, fail at being normal, and somehow become more herself than she had ever been before. "The contract expires next week," Adelaide said. "I know." "We should talk about what happens next." Henry was quiet for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, full of everything they hadn't said, every moment they had shared, every wall they had slowly dismantled. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "That night in the rain," he said, "you asked me to marry you because you were afraid of losing everything. You were running from something, not toward someone. And I said yes because I had no choice, because my daughter's safety mattered more than my pride." Adelaide nodded, her throat tight. "But I've been watching you for 6 months." Henry continued. "I've watched you burn your hands learning to wash dishes. I've watched you stand up to people who could destroy you. I've watched you hold my daughter when she cried and promise her you wouldn't leave. I've watched you become someone I could trust, someone I could respect, someone I could love." He stood, walked around the table, and knelt in front of her. "Adelaide Monroe," he said, "you asked me to marry you in the rain, and I said yes because I had no choice. Now I'm asking you to marry me, and I'm asking because I want to, because I choose you, because I want to build something with you. Not an arrangement, not a contract, a family." Adelaide couldn't speak. Tears ran down her face. The first real tears she had cried in years. From the doorway, a small voice said, "Does this mean I can call her Mom now?" Gwen stood in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes, watching them with cautious hope. Adelaide opened her arms, and Gwen ran into them, and for a moment the three of them held each other in that tiny kitchen, in that small apartment, in that imperfect life that had somehow become everything. The wedding was small, no ballroom, no 500 guests, Just a city hall ceremony with Bonnie and Silas as witnesses, and Gwen as flower girl in a dress she had chosen herself. Pink with sparkles and absolutely perfect. Adelaide wore white, but not the designer gown she had abandoned in the rain. Something simpler. Something that let her breathe. Henry wore a suit he had bought himself, paid for with money he had earned at the job Adelaide had given him, but he had kept through merit and skill and the respect of everyone he worked with. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the room stayed silent. Constance and William had not been invited. They would not have come anyway. The kiss was real. After the ceremony, they walked to a small park near what had been Henry's apartment, the apartment they still lived in because Adelaide had discovered she didn't need a penthouse to be happy. Gwen ran ahead, chasing pigeons, her laughter echoing across the grass like music. "I never thought I'd end up here," Adelaide said, watching her daughter now, in every way that mattered, spin in circles until she got dizzy. "Neither did I," Henry admitted. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Henry pulled her close, his arms around her, his chin resting on her head. "I regret a lot of things. I regret the years I lost. I regret the anger I carried. I regret every moment I spent believing I wasn't worth anything." He tilted her face up to look at him. "But not you. Never you." Adelaide leaned into him, feeling something she had forgotten existed. Peace. Belonging. The simple warmth of being wanted for who she was. Not what she controlled. Gwen ran back, crashing into them both, demanding to be lifted. Her face flushed and her eyes bright. Adelaide picked her up, laughing as the little girl wrapped arms around her neck. "You're my family now," Gwen said seriously, with all the gravity a 7-year-old could muster. "That means you have to come to all my school plays. Every single one. And you have to help with homework. I'll try, but math is hard. And you have to love Daddy forever." Adelaide looked at Henry, at the man who hadn't kneeled, who had taught her to stand, who had given her something no amount of money could ever buy. "That," she said, "I can promise." The three of them walked home together as the sun set over the city, leaving behind the ballroom, the boardroom, and every contract that had ever tried to define what love should look like. Adelaide Monroe had run into the rain chasing something she couldn't name. She had found a family instead, and for the first time in her life, she understood that winning wasn't about power or control or being the smartest person in the room. It was about having someone worth fighting for, someone who would never ask her to be anything but herself, someone who had looked at her in the rain, dripping wet and desperate and imperfect, and seen not a CEO or an heiress or a chess piece, but a woman worth choosing. She had spent 32 years building an empire. It took one man, one child, and one tiny apartment to show her what home actually meant.